And now we've arrived here at the end of the Kiryu saga. Or that's what I would be saying if not for the RGG summit. Right, Joryu? Speaking of which, the Song of Life. Hard to imagine that this is the only game in the West to have a subtitle up to this point. Granted, in Japan, the Yakuza games have had subtitles as far back as Yakuza 4, but Yakuza 6 was the only one to have a subtitle in the West. Up until Yakuza Like a Dragon, that is, but oh god, that's a whole mess I don't want to get into. That being said, Yakuza 6 was released in 2016 in Japan. It was released internationally in 2018. It was the first game to utilize RGG Studios' now infamous Dragon Engine. It was also touted as the last game which would feature Kiryu as a protagonist, essentially ending his story, but now, I mean, let's just get into it. Yakuza 6's story begins literally right at the end of Yakuza 5, where Kiryu is crawling through the snow trying to get to Haruka after defeating Aizawa. Haruka ends up sort of meeting him halfway and manages to get him to a hospital after basically ending her idol career and admitting that Kiryu was a former Yakuza. Regardless, Kiryu, Majima, Saejima, Haruka, and Akiyama all meet up at the hospital where Saejima, Daigo, and Kiryu are all arrested. I'm just gonna assume Shinada went back to Kenicho and is railing Milky-chan on the regular now because we never see him again. Anyway, Kiryu basically wants to atone for what he did by spending time in jail, so after 3 years in the can, he returns to Morning Glory, only to find that not only is Haruka not there, she's missing, and after a brief stint in Kamurocho, he finds out that she's gotten busy since his time in the joint and now has a child named Haruto. From then on, Kiryu makes his way to Hiroshima in hopes of finding Haruka's father after she's incapacitated, but as is the case with anything, the Yakuza aren't too far behind, as Kiryu must go through them in order to find Haruto's father. All I can say is, thank God that Yakuza 6 took a break from multiple protagonists and decided to focus on one focused story instead of splitting up everything between multiple characters, as it's much easier to follow. Like, don't get me wrong, I love games like Yakuza 0 which did that exact thing, but when Yakuza 4, and especially Yakuza 5, did this at the cost of a coherent narrative, it drove me nuts, and it's so refreshing to be able to just play a game and understand everything from beginning to end. That being said, there are some points where I think the plot drags a little bit, but overall the story of Yakuza 6 is great, despite being very streamlined since the last few games. Getting into the visuals, as I said before, Yakuza 6 was the first game to use the Dragon Engine, and I still think this game looks really impressive to this day. The town of Kamurocho has seen a major overhaul since Yakuza Kiwami, and the sun-soaked beaches of Hiroshima are stunningly beautiful. Plus, unlike Kiwami 2, this game has an FPS boost on Xbox Series X, allowing it to be run at a crispy clean 60 frames per second the entire time. Granted, the Dragon Engine did have a few hiccups with its first outing, such as some pretty glitchy dead body physics, and it's even persisted into Yakuza 7, just to a lesser extent, but overall, full marks for the presentation. The music is pretty decent, although I will admit that there aren't too many memorable tracks in Yakuza 6 as compared to the last few games. I mostly blame that, though, on Kiwami 0 and 5 having some really banger music that was just incredibly hard to live up to. Now we move on to everyone's favorite topic here, that being the gameplay. Yakuza 6 decided to forgo the aspect of multiple fighting styles popularized by Ishin, Zero, and Kiwami, and instead decided to go with one singular fighting style which, in my opinion, really hampered the gameplay. Granted, due to the 60 FPS, I don't hate it as much as Kiwami 2, but block bouncing is still a thing, and I will never like block bouncing, especially when it doesn't apply to the enemies. Now, all things considered, while I don't love the combat in Yakuza 6, I also don't hate it, and the Extreme Heat mode does add a tiny bit of variety, on top of being utterly goddamn broken once you start upgrading it. Regardless, for the first outing in the series to utilize this combat, it could have been a lot worse, and I give it a pass mostly on the basis of being experimental and working well enough that I didn't hate it. One thing I will criticize is the lack of both the Champion District and the northern parts of Kamurocho, as they literally don't exist here. I don't know why, I don't understand why they couldn't have just fit in there, they're just gone. There's also a clan creator minigame and a baseball management minigame, which I have absolutely no idea how to work, as I am fucking stupid when it comes to baseball. The last thing I'll note about the gameplay is that, oddly enough, this is the only game in the series that I've played aside from Dead Souls, Lost Paradise, and Ishin, which were all spin-offs, that doesn't have any form of taunting, and I couldn't help but feel that there could have been some implementation of that with the unused buttons on the controller, kind of like what they eventually did in Kiwami 2. Overall, Yakuza 6 The Song of Life is a great game that tells the story about the ending to one of gaming's most badass protagonists. However, there is a problem with this game that really doesn't come into play until years after it came out, and this is where I'm going to get into slight spoilers here, so be warned. RGG, you gotta learn when to just end a character properly. The ending to the Song of Life was a great finale to Kiryu, and was a heartbreaking for people like myself who loved this series. But Kiryu evidently isn't gone, and is even going to be a co-protagonist in Like a Dragon 8. But you also gotta stop bringing back characters who've been confirmed dead for years. I mean, you literally brought back 2 characters in Yakuza 7 that have been dead for years, and now you bring the Dragon of Dojima out of retirement, and just... I want to just have good, new characters. Also, Akiyama's in the game for a few scenes, but he really doesn't have a lot to do in the grand scheme of things, so... yeah, that was disappointing too. Still, I'd ultimately recommend Yakuza 6, as the story really does shine here, and has a lot of motifs from Yakuza 3 that I actually really loved. The Dragon of Dojima's main saga may be over, but they made sure his last bout was a fiery one.